there, my Lord and I. Now may dismiss the class.
In Job chapters 9 and 10, if you want to go ahead and be turning your Bibles there. Of course, we talked about Bildad and Eliphaz, their responses to Job, which we started in Job chapter 3, and that lament on the part of Job, you'll recall. And then I think Eliphaz responds, and Job has some things to say, and then Bildad is quite a bit more forthright, or somewhat more forthright. Doesn't even seem to have a compassionate edge anywhere in this. And we talked about his line of argumentation, which once again was a lot of good stuff if it applied. It just doesn't apply to Job's circumstance. So it's not that when you read what he says that there's not a level of truth in most everything that he says, except it's not truth that applies to Job's scenario. Job chapters 9 and 10. You remember when we went through Job chapter 3 and we talked about how it just felt like, you almost feel depressed just reading it. If you're really reading it and you just feel like Job is in the just blackest bottom of maybe depression over this situation. Well, he's going to kind of turn a corner, but not really. You're going to feel like, okay, this reminds me of chapter 3 when we get into chapters 9 and 10. But you might say he's crying out to God. There is a sense, and I can't see where he necessarily charges God with sin. But he does, it seems to me, cry out to God in a very assertive way, we'll say. Okay, he's very assertive in this was the paradigm, that thing's all messed up. Therefore, it's me and God. God's sovereign, so he must be responsible entirely for this situation without he's not able to consider any other dynamics like we are because we have chapters 1 and 2. But from his perspective, from his human perspective, with what he had believed and where he is now, and he's got this discussion going on with his friends, it's not completely unreasonable, the things that he says. And they are the things people who are in grief and in agony and in anguish feel. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. Now, by way of introduction, if it's possible, and you'll have to bear with me here a little bit and try to hear what I'm saying, and not so much from a logical standpoint, but from the standpoint of someone who's suffering. If it's possible to be wrong and right at the same time, that's where Job is. He is, and you'll see this in chapters 9 and 10 and as we go throughout the rest of the book. Is Job completely accurate in everything he says toward God about? No. Yet, do you remember what God is going to say to him at the end of the book? Or about him in chapter 42 and verse 7. About you remember he says of his friends, and he distinguishes Job's friends from Job. He says his friends have not spoken of me that which is right. Now he's going to correct Job, but he doesn't have that kind of rebuke or reproof for Job. So what I mean by this is although he's inaccurate in some of his understandings, he's limited and finite as we are, as he's trying to, process all of this. There's something about Job's heart that is very much right as far as what God is concerned, as far as God is concerned. And that is that Job is continuing to seek God, even in his despair, even in his difficulty. That is the thing about Job. He has been faithful to God. And there are a lot of things Job is saying that are right. But clearly, there's God, when you get to the divine speeches and that kind of thing, is trying to teach Job and transform Job and get Job to have a better perspective of things. Joel, what were you going to say?
So, it seems that Job and his friends, they understand that there is Job and there is God. But we know that the devil is in the background. Did they have
I don't think so.
no perception of the devil? So,
It doesn't sound like it.
because I mean, this is happening, if I'm understanding correctly, somewhere between, somewhere in Genesis.
Yeah, that'd be fair.
Timeline. So
Yeah.
they had an idea of some type of adversary with Adam and Eve and the serpent. But was that for God?
Yeah, but who wrote that? Actually, there's some arguments that Job may be the oldest book in Hebrew Scripture.
Right.
So as far, if we get timelines, so Moses wrote Genesis. So this would have been before, Job. So we don't know all the authorship and all, and I don't want to get bogged down in that. But to your point, I'll say this, that even throughout the Old Testament, you see progressive revelation. And so, how much they knew or what they didn't know, we know they didn't know a lot. They didn't have a fully... In fact, Job's friends, nor Job, to your point, don't ever really talk about the Satan or Satan or, it's God and us. Now, is that because of their view of the sovereignty of God and their thing? They just don't ever really talk about him. Now, we do see language about him in the Old Testament, but it seems like it progresses when you get into the prophets and that kind of thing. So I just think it's a case of progressive revelation, that we're getting more and more and more. So therefore, because Job's on the front end of it, they don't have a fully developed concept. A good question, though, or a good point. Anybody else? Okay. So do you guys kind of feel what I'm saying about, or get what I'm saying, that while Job's not, 100% accurate in everything he's saying about God, and he has some misconceptions that need to be corrected, there's something very good and very right about Job seeking God, continuing to seek God, and being honest with God, and not, thinking God needs to be shielded from Job's raw emotion and feelings and grief. That's not a real relationship. In contrast to, I think, where his friends are, that you shouldn't even be uttering these words. You shouldn't even be having these thoughts. But it's one thing to say that on the outside. It's something else to say that when you know I've been as faithful as I can be. He didn't say he was sinless. He doesn't think he was sinless. And that's going to become clear in chapters 9 and 10. But he doesn't think whatever sins he may have committed were any kind of intentional rebellion against God that should have been the foundation for this kind of situation. Okay, what were you going to say?
I think too, I don't guess we know how long the time period lapses over the course of the book, but we all experience ups and downs, faith and obedience and attitude and things we say.
Right, yeah.
I think Job went through some of those things. It wasn't just like he was just completely level through the whole thing. And so there probably were occasions when he was lower than others.
Right.
And I think too about God's assessment of him. God didn't say, Job, you're wrong about yourself. I think his assessment of himself was pretty accurate. He knew he hadn't changed in his attitude and his actions toward God. It was these times that he went through and his assessment of God that God took issue with it at some level.
And Job's faith is non-linear. In other words, what I mean, sometimes kind of the flat line approach, and A, B, C, D, and this is the conclusion. Well, there's times where that's part of our discussion about truth and that kind of thing. But that doesn't always adequately describe the dynamic nature, the growing nature, the developing nature of faith, or even the human experience. And so Job's friends want it to be very linear. And that's not how this is working. And that's not, when we get into divine speeches, I keep talking about it all the way through, but when you get into divine speeches, I think that's where the friends are missing it and Job's getting it. He doesn't understand everything about God. But there's this very vivid presentation of the wonder and the greatness and the love and the power and the majesty of God. But it's not stuck just in one box. Okay, and that's going to be important as we progress. Okay, what do you got, Mike?
Well, I think, too, the prevailing theme, speaking specifically of Job through this entire experience, was the prevailing theme with Job was why? Why am I going through this?
Mm-hmm. He does ask that.
But he never at any time during this period adapted to or embraced what his friends were telling him. He never took that on.
Nor did he deny the existence of God. That just wasn't an option. Oh, very good. Good point. And so what we're seeing is just the struggles of a man that is a real believer. His heart seeks to be deeply right before God. And God never says Job's heart is not right with him, which is the very thing the friends keep saying. That's basically what they're saying, is your heart's not right with God. You're not thinking right. You're not the kind of servant of God you should be. And you won't even take your own counsel that you used to give and all this kind of thing. But God never indicates that at all. In fact, the very opposite of that is going to be said. Toby.
I think it helps show progression of his faith as far as he's a righteous man, but I mean
You're right. Go ahead with it.
But everything right.
Yeah.
A lot of times you think, okay, so you've been baptized, you should just automatically know
all this. Yeah. No.
So it helps, for me, it helps to know, okay, you grow as a Christian, and as you grow, you learn
Right.
more.
Right. Being right with God doesn't mean I have perfect knowledge of. I'd have to be God Himself to have that. Okay. Now, what we come to understand from chapters 1 and 2, and this is what I want you to think about, and this is what I think the friends of Job certainly don't get, but even Job is going to struggle with in chapters 9 and 10, is this. And that is that God can use evil agents. And I want you to stay with me, okay? God can use evil agents and even unfair events to express His grace and bring about victory over evil. Okay, let me say that again. God can use evil agents and even unfair events to express His grace and to bring about victory over evil. And there are multiple examples of that. And we talk about progressive revelation. We're able to look at it from this standpoint and think about Nebuchadnezzar, think about Pharaoh, think about all those things. Think about the crucifixion of Christ. That certainly was not if you just went 2 + 2 = 4, that's not a fair event. Even God Himself suffering for us. Sometimes we get too far into saying, well, is this fair? Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, God can be faithful, and not everybody has the same human experience. There are people that have a much worse experience for whatever reason this side of eternity from a physical standpoint or from an emotional standpoint than some other folks. That's just reality. That's just the way it is. But what I want you to hear what I'm saying. So, Job is looking at this and going, okay, it just feels like it's God and me and suffering, and I don't know what I've done that would have precipitated this or caused this. And he's thinking fair. And I've had people, when I say God doesn't always, what we think of as fair, and we could talk about all of us need God's grace and God's not indebted to anybody, and I get that. I realize that. But God Himself has acknowledged that what He's allowing to happen is not fair. It's not that Job has committed this grievous, act of unfaithfulness and now He's punishing him for it. He has a purpose, though. Now, is God faithful? Yes. And whatever situation we're in. And we all ask, is this fair? It depends on your view of that. I could ask, why have not worse things happened to me than what have happened to me? Is that fair? That's still by grace. But my point to you is, and you're going to see this in chapters 9 and 10, I think. Well, Job is looking at this doesn't seem fair. I don't get this. I don't understand this. And he's having to work through this. And of course, that's going to, the why is not necessarily going to be answered. But I think the short-sighted view of God is going to be declared. And that's going to be enough for Job when we get there. Okay. And to go with that, the agencies God may use for His divine purposes do not necessarily reveal His character. Let me give you an example. Okay, because God uses Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the story of the book of Habakkuk. Because He uses Nebuchadnezzar does not mean Nebuchadnezzar's character reflects God's character. Are y'all following what I'm saying? So I can't look at Nebuchadnezzar's wicked character and say, since God used a wicked character, he must be wicked. That's not true. Okay? And we could go through the Bible and get that. But you have to realize that's hard for Job right now. And that's going to be hard for us on occasion. All right. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. Let's read chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. Then Job answered, in truth I know that this is so. Now, you have to go back to chapter 8. That's Bildad making these statements. Job says, in truth I know that this is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Wise and hard and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? Now we need to talk a little bit about this. Job is not saying Bildad's line of argumentation regarding himself and this situation is right. He's not granting that. So what's he saying? Go ahead.
Under the best of circumstances, you can't stand before God righteous. That's the validity that Job was lending to Bildad's argument.
Right. So Job's not saying Bildad's right about him, but he is saying, and I think he probably is saying, look, okay, Bildad, I know how the system's supposed to work. Okay, I get it. I know what you're saying or why you're saying it. But, okay, let's take your argument that you're like, you need to be right before God. There is a sense in which who can ever stand, and really say, I'm myself on my own merits, on my own faithfulness, right before God. Bildad, you can't stand that way. I can't stand that way. Eliphaz can't stand that way. I think there is a truth, and I don't know that Job is getting a full insight into this, but if he would run with this a little bit more, he might get him a little closer to some important things. But clearly he's going to say, and this is going to set up the rest of Job's speech, is, here's how he feels. He feels like I don't have a prayer. If this, on one hand I want this kind of courtroom scene, me and God, but I don't have a chance with that. He's not a man like I am. He's stronger. He's more powerful. And later he's going to say, even if I am right, what comes out of my mouth will be wrong. What chance do I have to stand, or anybody, Eliphaz, Bildad, anybody, before God? And how can I bring my case before Him? Alan, what were you going to say? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So there in chapter 9, he says, if one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him. Once in 1,000 times, wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? Now, chapter 9 and verse 3, if you'll look at that there. Does anybody have a different rendering in your translation in chapter 9 and verse 3 for dispute? To contend. Does anybody have anything else other than contend? I think contend and dispute are the most common. When you think of contend, it's kind of legal language, to take issue with. How am I going to be able to contend with the God of heaven? Now, does Job feel like he's got a legitimate case to come before the judge of the living? Sure. But he says in light of who he is, and we're thinking power, strength, how could I ever be able to do that? Who can survive standing up to God, you might say? So that leads us to the major section here. And it seems to me that Job is viewing God's sovereignty, but it seems that he thinks God's sovereignty has been arbitrary. And that goes back to, I think, Mike's point about the why. Okay, this system I had, the why was answered, but the problem is the system doesn't answer every situation. Okay, I have the why answered. If somebody's unrighteous and God pours judgment out on them, okay, it makes sense. And if God blesses the faithful, that makes sense. But if you have those who are faithful going through what I'm going through, I don't have the why answered here. So if thus the only other response would be a feeling, even though it's not that this is actually the case, but this is how Job feels like it's very arbitrary. Now, he's done this before, but let's look at chapter 9 and let's read verses 5 through 10. Who would like to read, Joel? Go ahead. Chapter 9, verses 5 through 10. And before Joel reads that, do you remember, it was earlier on where we talked about a reversal of the creation order language? I don't know if you remember that, which is common in Scripture, where God's power and strength in the moral order is described in light of the trees and the mountains and everything being like it ought to. And Job, I think this was chapter 3, where he goes back and uses language which describe what some have called cosmic disorder. You'll see what I'm saying when Joel reads this. But it's reversal. But he's not just talking about, the natural realm, the trees and the mountains and all that. He's saying everything that should be in this orderly case for me is reversed and turned upside down. Okay? So go ahead and read that, Joel.
It is God who removes the mountains. They know not how when he overturns them in his anger, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun not to shine and sets a seal upon the stars, who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea, who makes the bear, Orion, and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, who does great, unfathomable, and wondrous things without number.
Okay, so hang on to that thought. There you have, it almost sounds like judgment language, might, strength, power. But look at what he says there. It is God who removes the mountains, they know not how. Who overturns them in his what? Anger. Right now, he feels a very angry view of God. Who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble, who commands the sun not to shine, who sets a seal upon the stars, who alone stretches out the heavens, who tramples down the ways of the sea. Now, there's other passages that use that kind of language. Verse 10, who does these great, unfathomable things and wondrous works without number. I mean, how am I going to stand before him? In Psalms 82, there's language in Psalms 82 of God being ruler, of God judging, of all of these things. God takes his stand in his own congregation. He judges in the midst of the rulers. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now, when he says the foundations of the earth are shaken in Psalms 82, what's he really talking about? Okay. Look at Psalms 82. Go ahead, Darryl. Right. We're not just talking about trees and mountains and all of that. That is what is Job? This is poetry. Okay. So often in the Scripture, sometimes there's other passages where God's moral order, where the righteous being blessed, and he'll describe God's creation being very orderly. But in other passages like this one, like Psalms 82, and there's others we could look at, Psalm 75, Psalms 104. But we see it in Job. This is what Job is doing, the same thing that the psalmist is doing when he describes the foundations are shaken, God's might and strength and power. What he's describing is the order doesn't seem to be what it should be, though. Now, there's other passages that speak of God faithfully, blessing the righteous and all of this, but there's some other passages as well. So what is Job really saying? basically Job's view of God, which is very inaccurate to be fair, but what Job is saying is, what kind of hope, okay, how am I, first of all, going to even stand before this judge in this courtroom scene? How can I, bring any charge about this situation to him? First of all, he's so powerful and he is sovereign, but right now he feels like, how am I going to bring against a logical charge against this very wild and manic and disordered God? Now that's what he's saying. It's not the truth, but that's how he feels. He can't see where A equals B, therefore God must not be operating in that way. Okay. That's what suffering will do to you. Now, you may know better. You may know there must be. I'm sure Job thought, I just think he probably thought, is there some other explanation? Because he'll say these things and then he'll come back and almost apologize without apologizing. And he'll say these things. And that's kind of what happens when you're going through grief. But there is that sense in those verses. Now, there's something else he's going to bring up. Another reason why this won't work for him to come into God's presence and bring any kind of charge, even though he really wants to. He's saying, I feel like I have a legitimate case here. Let's read verses 11 through 13. Dino, can you do that for me? Verses 11 through 13.
Lo, he goeth by me, and I see him not. His path is on also, but I perceive him not. Behold, he taketh away, who can hinder him? Who will say unto him, what doest thou? If God will not withdraw his anger, the proud helper do stoop under him.
Okay. What does he seem to be saying? Okay, first of all, before you go there, he's basically saying, I feel that God is arbitrary. Now, secondly, there's some other aspect of the nature of God that I feel like that makes it impossible for this really to happen. Go ahead.
You can't see him, you can't touch him. He's not really sure how to communicate with him.
Right. I mean, he can cry out to him, but I don't know that he feels there's any response. He's invisible. It's not like me talking to Toby or to Alan, where I can see them. He seems elusive. And the God that he thought was always there, now he's not so much feeling like he knows he's there, but not in that comforting, warm, probably sense of blessing. He doesn't understand him. So it's as if the transcendence of God not being confined to what we're confined to causes there to be a sense of separation. So when you look at verse 11, chapter 9, verse 11, were he to pass by me, I wouldn't see him. I mean, he could be right here beside me and I wouldn't see him. And again, this is poetic. This is poetry. Were he to move past me, I would not perceive him. And now he certainly doesn't think he feels his presence or believes that he is on his side. He thinks God is against him. Were he to snatch away, who could restrain him? Who could say to him, what are you doing? I mean, who can say that to this elusive, invisible, transcendent, powerful God? Verse 13, God will not turn back his anger. And then he makes this statement, which we probably need to talk about. Beneath him crouched the helpers of Rahab, is what the New American Standard Bible says. Does anybody have a different rendering on verse 13? Does everybody say Rahab?
The allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him.
Read that again, Kimberly.
The allies of the proud lie prostrate.
Oh, the allies of the proud. What translation is that?
New King James.
Okay, that's interesting. What did you say? Proud helpers. Anybody else? Does anybody have Rahab? Americans? Probably because it's in the text. Why? Now, it's okay. I'm not being critical here of the New King James. I would never want to do that. That's a fair interpretation of the helpers of Rahab. I mean, it is. I think that's where you end up. I think that's why this is brought up. But it is interesting. It's not talking about Rahab. Forget Rahab that you're thinking of, probably, right? Well, I thought Rahab was a good... No, it's not talking about that. I don't think. And that's why the New King James doesn't render it. They're probably trying to take away the confusion. Does anybody else have any other rendering? Anybody got an ESV in here? I don't have any ESV people. Okay, you do, Rebecca? Helpers of Rahab. Okay, so does anybody know, do you have any notion of what that might be talking about? Okay, you will when you leave today. All right? Lord willing, if I do anything right. And there is a level of ambiguity. There's a lot of scholarship that says, man, we don't really know for sure. But this is not the only time this is mentioned. Let's come to Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah, this is very kind of poetic, prophetic. Isaiah 26 and verse 12. Oh, that's not what I wanted. No, Job 26. Let's try that one. Maybe that'll work. Yeah. Job 26:12. I'm sorry. And you'll notice all this language when Rahab is used in the way we're talking about it. It's not talking about the Rahab that comes up as an example of faith. It's always God is against this Rahab. Verse 12, he quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. Isaiah 51:9, I think, is what I was looking for. I hope that's the right verse. Yes, this kind of helps. Isaiah 51 verse 9. So, basically here in 9:11 through 13, verse 13, he's saying even the helpers of Rahab had no hope against him. And then we saw where he shattered these kinds of folks in 26:12. Isaiah 51 in verse 9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces? And look at the next question. Who pierced the dragon? Okay. Now, does anybody, does the New King James render that, does it say proud there too in verse 9? It says Rahab. Okay, good. All right. So, obviously, that's not talking about, the Rahab we normally think of. So, from the reading I've done, there, even in the Babylonian creation myth, the idea of Leviathan, which we know is going to come up, and these sea monsters, and those notions of chaos and even evil, considered evil, through Job that he pulls on. Rahab was a description of that. Now, it described arrogance and chaos and rebellion and wickedness and evil and that kind of thing. This is probably the reason the New King James Version is interpreting that to say, let's get past that. What's he really saying? Okay. And what he's saying is that even the helpers of the most arrogant and the most proud, even if he's, pulling on poetic language from a variety of sources, even the helpers of what seem to be the most powerfully arrogant and proud have not a prayer against Yahweh, okay, against the true God. So when you see that, don't think of, Rahab and her faith. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying, listen, how can I come before God when even those who are in alliance for the most proud don't have a prayer? Now, what is interesting, this later becomes a nickname for Egypt. Now, that makes sense. So later on, if you look at, for instance, Psalms 87:4, 89:10, Isaiah 30 and verse 7, I'm not going to read all those. But what happens is this language that would have been representative of the most arrogant and the most proud and viciously wicked eventually is used as a representative or a figure for Egypt. And that makes sense with the story we know about Pharaoh and his hardness of heart and him rebelling against God and the idolatry of that people and all of that. So Job's language is not unique to Job. And what it's saying is, look, the most powerful, arrogant, proud, chaotic, wicked, evil, they can't stand against God. So if that's true, how can I come and bring my case to Him? Okay, does that make sense more if you see that? That even the most proud don't have a chance against this sovereign God. Okay, look at chapter 9 and verses 14 through 20. He says, "How then can I answer him and choose my words before him? For though I were right, I could not answer. I would have to implore the mercy of my judge. If I called and he answered me, I could not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he bruises me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to get my breath. He saturates me with bitterness. If it is a matter of power, behold, he is the strong one. And if it is a matter of justice, who can summon him? Though I am righteous." So he's still saying, I believe I'm right as far as how I'm trying to live. "Though I am righteous, my mouth will condemn me. Though I am guiltless, he will declare me guilty." And then he goes on to say, "I am guiltless. I do not take notice of myself. I despise my life." So he's not saying I'm guilty. He's just saying, have you ever been I don't know if you have, but even though you thought you had a case, have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and you felt like you were stumbling over your words and you couldn't get the right words out and you're really nervous, and they were really good with words and they're just, word masters. And even though you think you've got a case, it feels like you're guilty even though you're not guilty. Job is saying, I'm going to come before the God of heaven, and even if I feel like I am right, I still will sound like I'm wrong. I mean, how am I going to do this? Okay, so that's his statement there in chapter 9 and verses 14 through 20. And really, all he could possibly do, if you look at verse 15, he said, I would have to implore the mercy of my judge. And right now, he's not really seeing that he's been all that merciful to him. He doesn't feel God is really going to listen to him. What does Job feel like? If you look at verses 16 through 19, what does he feel like he has been experiencing from God? Yeah. I mean, it's not, it feels like abuse. Now, we know the story. You've got to get into how he's thinking. Now, here's the wonderful thing about the God that we serve. He still loves Job. He still has all the confidence in the world in Job. He still sees the goodness in Job. Some of us have a view of God that if someone ever cried out this way to God, God's just going to say. But that's not God. In fact, in chapter 2 and verse 3, the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity. Although you incited me against him to ruin him without" what? Cause. Now, if you are doing it without cause, doesn't mean God is unfaithful, but is this a 2 + 2 = 4 fair situation? You can understand why Job feels the way he does. All right, so chapter 9, verses 25 through 35. Job comes up with only three possible ways he can see out of this. Again, this is very poetic. 3 possible ways. Verses 27 through 29. He says, "Though I say I will forget my complaint, I will leave off my sad countenance and be cheerful. I'm afraid of all my pains. I know that you will not acquit me. I am accounted wicked. Why then should I toil in vain?" So what does that sound like? He said, well, I could do this. I could do what? What does Job say he could do?
I guess just let it go.
Yeah, kind of. Pretend. Put happy face on. I'll make my friends feel better. Because they're kind of depressed with my depression here. Or my grief. It's not that I think Job is saying, okay, this would make everything okay. But he said that would be one option. I could, put a happy face on, make everybody else happy that I'm acting like, okay, whatever. But what I want you to see is if it was just about the physical suffering, then that might be a real option. But all this suffering for him has caused him to think that he doesn't have that standing with God. And so the pain, he says, my pain is still there. He's not just talking about his body. He's talking about the fact that physical pain and grief assaults you on a spiritual level. Okay? So that's really not going to work. All right? Look at verses 30 and 31. If I should wash myself with snow and cleanse my hands with lye, yet you would plunge me into the pit and my own clothes would abhor me. What's he saying? Okay, this is option 2. So if putting a happy face on is not going to work, then what might he try? And by the way, this responds to all of his friends saying, well, Job, you're just so arrogant, you won't even... No. This shows something else. What are you saying, Darren?
There's a repentance.
Yeah.
If I say, okay, I've been wrong, that he doesn't know what to repent of.
Yeah, that's right. He doesn't think he has anything, but if there is something. So it does seem like here that he's saying, okay, if me just doing that would make all this, but his view of God right now, you hear this, man, this is pretty, I'd be afraid to say this, I'll be honest with you. So he says, if I do that, if I try to find, okay, I'm looking around for something that needs to be cleansed, I can't find anything, but if I went ahead and went through the motions as though there were something, what does he think would happen to him then? Does he think that'll make everything okay? Don't go anywhere. Do you think he thinks that'll make everything okay? No. He says, the way I'm feeling right now, God would throw me back into that tar pit and I'll be dirty all over again. That's not going to fix. That's not the honest, transparent thing. Okay, before we leave, a third possibility, and we'll pick up here. He says, if only I had. Now, this is really interesting because there is a sense in which you can't help, in our minds, think about Jesus. If I had a mediator, if I had a go-between, if I had somebody that could represent me better than I can represent myself to the God of heaven that could understand the nature of both parties here, that's what I need. And that's what we're going to talk about next Sunday morning. Okay? We'll talk more then.